Colorado Territory, July 1874. The flood had torn through the valley just 3 days ago, but the land still stank of mud, rot, and ruin when Gideon O'Connell rode south along the swollen banks of the South Platte River. The sun was out, high and harsh, but nothing looked dry. Loose boards and broken fence posts were caught in the trees like old bones. He had not meant to come this far. He had only meant to check the damage along the ranch fence line, but something in his gut kept pulling him forward. He found her in what was left of a shack, tucked against a low ridge half buried by the flood. One side of the roof was gone. The front wall had folded in like paper. And inside, sitting on her knees in soaked skirts and holding a small boy wrapped in a blanket, was a woman who looked like she had not slept in days. Gideon dismounted slow, keeping his hands visible. "Ma'am," he called over the wind. "You all right?" The woman looked up. Her dark hair was stuck to her cheeks. Her eyes were wide, not from fear but from exhaustion. The boy in her arms stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Another child, a girl maybe 6 or 7, sat beside her with one arm clutched around her mother's waist and the other holding what looked like a cracked tin cup. "We're alive," the woman said. Her voice was hoarse. "That's all I can say. I'm Gideon O'Connell. I have a place about 15 miles north. You're welcome to come with me." He stepped closer through the mud, eyeing the way her hand trembled. "Can you walk?" She shifted to stand, but her legs buckled. Gideon moved without thinking, catching her elbow. She let him, too tired to protest. "My name's Marigold Zamora," she said quietly, her breath catching. "These are my children, Farah and Finn." Farah looked up, her face sticky with dried tears. She did not speak, just stared. Finn slept on, his curls damp against his mother's chest. Gideon looked at the mule tied behind his gelding. He had brought the animal in case he found a stray calf. "It would do. I got a spare horse. Mule, actually, steady enough for you and the boy. Farah can ride with me." He met Marigold's eyes. "Let me get you out of here." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Please." He helped her up onto the mule, steadying her as she settled Finn in her lap. Then he lifted Farah into his own saddle and swung up behind her. She leaned back against him without a word, her small hands gripping the horn. They rode slow, the late sun casting long shadows across the soaked prairie. Marigold was quiet most of the way, but Gideon kept glancing back, checking that she had not fainted. Finn stayed limp in her arms. When they reached the sloping rise that marked the edge of his land, Marigold let out the faintest sigh, like the sight of dry ground had given her lungs back their strength. The ranch house was plain but solid. Whitewashed boards, a porch that creaked when he stepped on it. He led them inside, where it smelled like wood smoke and old pine. He had not expected visitors today, let alone a woman with 2 children, but he stoked the stove and brought out the bread and dried apples he had. Marigold sat at the table, her arms still wrapped around Finn. Farah curled up on the bench beside her, eyes already drooping. "You need rest," Gideon said gently. "There's a room down the hall, clean blankets, you can all take it." "I do not want to put you out," she whispered. Her lips were cracked. She looked like she had not eaten in days. "You are not putting me out, Marigold." He said her name slowly, like it meant something already. "You need help, I want to help." She met his eyes then, and something passed between them, quiet but strong, a flicker of trust in the middle of all that ruin. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep in the back room and she had bathed with the water he heated on the stove, Marigold came back into the kitchen in one of his clean shirts. It hung loose on her, the sleeves rolled up. She looked at him across the table. "I did not think anyone would come," she said, voice low. "I really thought that shack would be the end of us." Gideon sat forward, resting his elbows on the wood. "What happened?" She told him about the storm, how the river rose faster than anyone thought it could. How her husband had left 2 winters ago and never come back. How she had been trying to make a life out there with nothing but a goat, a few hens, and prayer. "I should have left sooner," she said. "I kept thinking I could fix it, that if I just worked harder, stayed longer." "You did what you could," Gideon said. You kept them alive. That is no small thing. Marigold blinked hard, then looked away. I do not cry in front of them, not ever. You do not have to be made of stone to be strong. She looked at him again, slower this time. Her eyes lingered. You are kind, she said, almost like she was surprised. I just saw someone who needed help. She gave the faintest smile. That is not always enough to make someone stop. Gideon did not know what to say to that, so he stood, gently took her empty teacup and rinsed it in the basin. Behind him, she watched him without speaking. That night, as he lay in his own bed with the door cracked open in case the children stirred, Gideon could not sleep. His thoughts kept drifting to the way she had curled her hand around the mug, the way her voice had gone soft when she said his name. Marigold, he had not expected anything to shift in his life, not this summer, not this year. But finding her there half buried in mud and ruin, still holding her children close, had cracked something open in him, something he had not even known was closed. Maybe it was too early to call it anything, but maybe not. Because when he saw her in the doorway the next morning, barefoot and brushing Farah's hair with her fingers, and she looked at him like he was safe, he felt it again. Hope. Marigold stood at the edge of the corral, her skirt hem caught on a low rail, watching Farah hold out a handful of oats to the bay gelding. The morning had burned off its chill, and the breeze carried the scent of warm hay and horses. Finn sat in the shade of the tack shed, chewing a piece of dried apple and turning a stick through the dirt like it was a plow. Gideon leaned against the fence a few yards off, arms crossed over his chest, eyes on Marigold. You ever worked with horses? He asked. She glanced sideways. No. My father was a carpenter. We repaired wagons, not rode them. He nodded, pushing his hat up a bit. You've got the look of someone who doesn't scare easy. That gelding's gentle. You could try leading him if you like. Marigold stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. The rope felt rough in her hand, sun-warmed and worn. The gelding snorted once, then came willingly, his hooves soft in the dust. She smiled without meaning to. You've got a quiet way with him, Gideon said. I was always better with animals than people, she said, not turning. They don't ask questions they don't want the answers to. He came closer, lifting the latch on the gate and letting himself in. He didn't touch her, just walked beside her as they led the gelding in a slow circle. Don't figure I'm owed any answers, he said after a moment, but I've got eyes. You were holding that boy like you'd been waiting for someone to take him from you. She stopped walking. The gelding paused beside her, flicking his ears. I had a neighbor, she said slowly. A man who brought sugar once when he passed through, then flour. Then started saying things I didn't want my daughter hearing. He knew I was alone. When I wouldn't accept his help the way he wanted, he started talking about the law. About how folks might think I wasn't suited to raise 2 children out there by myself. Gideon's jaw shifted, his hands still at his sides. Did he try anything? No, but he made me afraid, and when the river came up and the roof caved in, I kept thinking maybe he'd see it as his chance. That if I didn't get them away, I might never get the choice again. He nodded once, slow. You won't have to worry about him here. Marigold looked up at him. Why are you doing all this? I give a damn, he said simply. That's all. They walked the gelding back to the rail and tied him off. Marigold brushed her palms on her skirt. The rope burned faint but real in her fingers. She looked toward the shed, where Finn was now curled up in a patch of sun, his stick forgotten. Farah had climbed onto a stump and was watching a meadowlark fluff its wings. I can't stay here without helping, she said. I'm not a guest. I never was good at sitting idle. I could use the help, he said. The fence line past the creek needs patching, and the vegetable beds haven't been turned since early spring. She folded her arms. I can manage a shovel. Maybe not the whole row in one go, but I'll get there. I'll show you where we keep the tools. They walked side by side toward the barn, not touching, not speaking for a while. The quiet between them wasn't heavy, it carried something like understanding. Inside the barn, dust floated in the shafts of light from the high slats. The air smelled of leather and sun-dried hay. Gideon reached for a shovel and handed it to her. Their hands brushed and she didn't pull away. I was going to head into town tomorrow, he said, Supplies. You and the children could come if you wanted. I won't force it, but I thought maybe you'd like to choose what you'll cook with. She looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. You're giving me a place, food, tools, and now a voice in the kitchen. I figure you've gone long enough without one. Marigold's shoulders eased. Then yes, I'd like that. He nodded again once, then stepped back. I'll get the wheelbarrow. The earth's heavy this time of year. She stood alone for a moment, her fingers tightening on the wooden shaft of the shovel. Then she turned and stepped out into the sun. Finn stirred at the sound of her boots, and Farah called out something about a bird's nest in the fence post. That evening, after the children had gone to bed with full bellies and clean hands, Marigold found Gideon on the back porch, seated on the top step. His boots were off. He held a mug of something warm, and the smell drifted toward her chicory and clove. "Is that what passes for coffee out here?" she asked, settling beside him. "I won't claim it's proper, but it does the job." She took the mug when he offered it. Their fingers met again, and this time both of them lingered on the contact. "My father used to say a porch like this was where people told the truth," she said. "Something about the dark making it easier." "I don't lie easy," he said, "but I do keep quiet." They sat in silence after that. The stars came out one by one, and the night sounds rose around them: crickets, the wind easing across the grass, the creak of the sign over the barn as it swung once, then settled. Marigold closed her eyes just for a moment and let her shoulder rest lightly against his. It wasn't bold. It wasn't even deliberate. But when he didn't move away, she let herself breathe deeper than she had in months. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of supplies, its wheels cutting long, curved ruts through the dry earth as Gideon steered it over the shallow rise into town. Marigold sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, fingers stained from the morning's weeding. Farah and Finn rode in the back, squinting at the sun through damp burlap draped to cut the dust. It was the first time she'd left the ranch since the flood. The town of Brush was no more than a few streets stitched together with raised boardwalks, the storefronts still bearing the soot marks from last spring's fire. A few men sat outside the livery, smoking hand-rolled tobacco and watching every wagon that passed. Children darted around barrels and hitched horses, their laughter sharp and sudden like birds breaking from trees. Gideon glanced down at Marigold. "You want to take the children to the mercantile? I'll see to the feed and the smithy." She nodded once, then turned to the wagon bed. "Farah, keep hold of your brother's hand. We're going inside." Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of lamp oil, dried citrus, and ground flour. Shelves lined the walls, some still half empty from the flood's disruption to the freight deliveries. Marigold moved with quiet purpose, choosing sacks of beans and cornmeal, a spool of thread, a jar of pickled onions that made Farah wrinkle her nose. Finn pressed his palms to the glass case of candies near the register, though he didn't ask for any. He'd learned not to. The shopkeeper, a woman with a tight braid coiled at the base of her neck, watched them closely. "You're new to town," she said, not unkindly. Marigold met her gaze. "Just here for supplies. We're staying north of the river, with the O'Connell place. For now." The woman's eyes softened. "He's a steady one, quiet but steady." Marigold offered the smallest nod and gathered the sack of flour into her arms. Outside, Gideon was already loading sacks of grain onto the wagon bed. His shirt clung to his back, sweat darkening the fabric between his shoulder blades. Marigold handed off the basket she carried, and he took it without looking, tying it down beneath the bench. "You all right in there?" he asked. She lifted her chin toward the children, who were watching a pair of dogs square off near the dry goods store. "No trouble." They rode out as the sun began to shift westward, the shadows lengthening behind them. The road home passed golden fields and cottonwood groves, the river beyond still swollen but no longer angry. Finn had fallen asleep against a sack of grain, his hand curled around Marigold's shawl. Farah leaned her head against the wagon's side, humming something soft she must have made up on her own. "You always live alone out there?" Marigold asked, breaking the quiet. Mostly, Gideon said. Had a brother once, went east after the war, sent letters for a while. Then stopped. She didn't press, he shifted the reins in his hands. I was engaged once, she didn't much care for the quiet. Marigold studied him, the way he kept his eyes on the road like he was afraid of looking back too long. I had a sister, she said after a pause. She married into a family near Las Animas. We wrote for a while too. I stopped replying after my husband left. I didn't want the pity. Maybe she wasn't offering that. I wouldn't have known the difference then. The sun dipped low enough to turn the dust to gold. Marigold reached up to adjust the shawl over Finn's shoulders and caught Gideon watching her. "What?" she asked, not defensive, only curious. "You've changed the way the place feels, is all." She looked down at her hands. "It's not mine to change." I didn't say I minded. They reached the ranch just before dusk. Gideon lifted Finn from the wagon bed and carried him inside. Farah helped unload the smaller parcels, her movements careful, deliberate, like she understood the value of eggshells and clean linens already. Later, after the children had eaten and gone to their corners of the back room, Marigold stood at the wash basin, wringing out a cloth. Her sleeves were rolled high and her hair had loosened from the braid she'd tied at dawn. Gideon entered with 2 mugs, one steaming, one slightly less so. He set hers beside the basin. "I don't know what your plans are," he said. "Long term," she turned, cloth still in her hands. "I don't either. You can stay as long as you need, longer if you want." I didn't think people offered that kind of thing without expecting something in return. I'm not most people. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed now. "And if I wanted to offer something back on my own terms?" He met her gaze, steady. "Then I'd listen." A slow quiet stretched between them, the kind that didn't press, didn't demand. Marigold stepped forward just enough to let the silence deepen. She reached for the mug and took a sip, then looked back at him over the rim. "You're not what I expected," she murmured. "Neither are you." And in the space between those two truths, something unspoken settled. Not a promise, but the shape of one forming. The rains had stayed gone for nearly a week now, leaving the earth dry enough to crack beneath boots. Gideon had taken to rising before light, using the cooler hours to mend the eastern fence stretch, where a cottonwood had splintered 3 posts clear through. By the time the sun reached the porch roof, he'd be back near the barn, sweat lining the collar of his shirt and dust worked deep into his palms. Marigold had begun tending the vegetable beds in earnest. She didn't ask for instruction. She paced the rows herself, felt the soil, and set to work turning and wetting the ground in a rhythm that seemed older than words. Finn helped by dragging water in a tin pail, careful not to spill. Farah had taken to carrying gooseberries in the pocket of her dress and leaving them on the windowsill, one at a time, like tiny offerings. That morning, Gideon returned from the fence line to find the table spread with biscuits, half a jar of plum preserves, and a bowl of beans soaking under a cloth. Marigold stood at the counter with her back to him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, one hand steadying a paring knife as she sliced dried venison with practiced care. He didn't speak at first, just watched the quiet motion of her hands. She turned slightly. "There's a man in town who asked after you." Gideon shifted, resting his knuckles on the table edge. What he looked like, broad shoulders, clean boots, said he was from Julesburg, didn't give a name. She set down the knife. He wasn't pressing. "Just asked if you still kept to yourself." "I don't know anyone from Julesburg," he said after a moment. "Could have been looking for someone else." He watched Farah when we left the store. Gideon nodded once, then stepped back through the door and into the yard. Marigold followed, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You think he means something by it?" Might not." He glanced toward the barn. "I'll ask around next time I ride in." She didn't press. Instead, she moved past him, into the strip of shade along the side of the house where the children had started planting wildflower seeds in broken jars. "Farah, take your brother inside. Wash up for dinner." The girl nodded and pulled Finn toward the porch by the hand. Once they were alone again, Marigold leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "There's something I haven't said," she began. "About the man who used to come by." Gideon didn't interrupt. He wasn't just a neighbor, he'd known my husband. Said things that made me think they'd done business together before I ever arrived. He claimed I owed him something, that the land wasn't mine to live on. Gideon stepped closer. "Did your husband ever say anything about that land being borrowed?" "No, but he was the kind to keep things quiet." "Even from me?" She looked down at her hands. "I didn't know about the debt until after he was gone." Gideon's voice stayed level. "What sort of debt?" "He left owing tools, nails, seed, maybe $100 in all. But in a place like that, folks don't care about the number. They care about who's left to pay it." He nodded slowly. "If the man comes back, he won't get near you. I'm not afraid for myself." Her voice caught. "It's the children." The way he looked at them, like they were just part of the weight I owed. Gideon reached out then, not sudden, not bold, just steady. He touched her wrist, his thumb brushing the soft inside where the skin ran pale. "They're safe here," he said. "With me." She didn't pull away. That night, after the sun sank and the house cooled, Marigold sat by the fire with Farah nestled against her side, her head heavy with sleep. Gideon sat nearby, mending the strap on the mule's bridle with careful fingers, the leather creaking soft as he worked. Marigold watched the flame for a long time, then spoke without looking up. "I stopped believing in things after he left, not just in love, in safety, in mornings that didn't start with worry." Gideon set the bridle aside. "And now I don't wake up afraid." The fire popped. Finn stirred in his little cot across the room, then settled again. Gideon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I didn't expect you. Didn't think there was room left in my life for something new." "There wasn't room in mine either," she said quietly. "But I think we made some." He reached for her hand then, slow and certain. She let him take it. They sat like that until the fire burned low, the room filled with the hush of sleeping children and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just two people, scarred in different ways, finding stillness in the same place. The wind shifted that week drier, coming down from the hills, bringing with it the scent of dust and juniper. It blew steady through the nights and left a fine layer of grit on everything by morning. The children adjusted quickly. Finn took to wearing Gideon's old hat, so large it dipped over his eyes, while Farah fashioned a scarf from a flour sack to tie over her nose. Marigold rose before dawn every day now, her steps precise, her hands sure. The garden had taken shape under her care, neat rows of beans and cabbage climbing stakes, a line of herbs growing along the edge. She still said little about the past, but her steps had a rhythm Gideon hadn't seen in her before, like she'd begun to believe the ground would hold. One morning, while Farah helped Gideon shoe the mule and Finn napped by the porch post, Marigold walked the edge of the property alone. She followed the line of the southern boundary, where the land sloped toward a dry creek, and found the remains of an old stone chimney half buried in golden grass. The ash had long since vanished, but a few blackened stones remained. She crouched beside them, brushing away a layer of soil, and uncovered a rusted horseshoe. That evening she set the horseshoe on the windowsill above the basin. "You find that near the ridge?" Gideon asked as he came in, wiping his hands on a scrap of cloth. "I think someone built there once." "Maybe before your time," he nodded. "There was a family, German, I think, tried to settle back before the war, didn't take. No one stayed long on that stretch." "Maybe they were alone too long," she said, eyes on the horseshoe. "It's easy to forget how much we need one another." Gideon leaned beside her against the wall. "I don't forget that anymore." She turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she reached up, touched his jaw with the edge of her fingers, and said, "Me neither." That night, Marigold asked Gideon to bring the rocker in from the porch. She placed it near the hearth, where the heat lingered even after the fire died to embers. Finn curled up in her lap as she rocked, his hair damp from the evening wash. Farah sat cross-legged on a braided rug, drawing with charcoal on scrap wood from a broken crate. "You ever thought about teaching?" Gideon asked. Marigold glanced down at her daughter, who was carefully sketching the mule's ears. "I used to," she said. "Back before I married, but it didn't seem possible after. You've got the patience for it, and the way Farah looks at you, she listens close." Marigold smiled faintly. "I wouldn't mind trying again if the town had use for it. I know the preacher's wife's been asking after someone. They turned the old storeroom next to the church into a schoolroom last fall." She nodded slowly. "Maybe I will." The subject changed. Gideon told her about a fox den he'd found near the hayfield. Marigold shared the story of a childhood friend who once tried to raise a raccoon in her father's shed. The laughter came easy, softened by the hour and the dim light. When the children were asleep, Gideon brought her tea and they sat together by the fire. She didn't ask where he'd learned to make tea with dried apple peel and sage, and he didn't offer. "Do you ever miss what your life was before?" she asked, not looking at him. "No," he answered simply. "I only miss what it might have been if I'd found you sooner." Her breath caught, but she didn't flinch. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She turned to him, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. "Then maybe it's time I stop waiting for the ground to fall out from under me." His hand found hers, warm and sure. "You don't have to wait anymore." They didn't rush toward one another. There was no suddenness in it, just a quiet, mutual step like the last brick sliding into place. When Gideon leaned down and kissed her, it was slow and certain, like a promise made not with words but with the steady weight of presence. Her hand found the back of his neck. He wrapped his arm around her waist. And the fire clicked softly in the hearth, as if it, too, understood what was being sealed. The next morning dawned with birdsong and clear skies. Marigold rose early, as she always did, but Gideon was already outside, splitting wood with his sleeves rolled high in a half-smile playing at the edge of his mouth when she stepped out with a mug in hand. "You're up early," she said. "Figured I'd make myself useful before the heat came on." She handed him the mug. "You already are." Farah ran out behind her, waving a folded paper. "Mama, I wrote my name without help." Marigold crouched, took the paper, and kissed her daughter's temple. "You did better than that. You wrote it like someone who's ready for school." They made the trip into town the next day. Marigold spoke with the preacher's wife and left the church with a small stack of primers and a promise to start teaching come week's end. Gideon stood outside the mercantile with the children, watching them chase chickens around the water trough, the sun warming the back of his neck. When Marigold returned, she tucked her hand into his without hesitation. On the ride home, Farah sang to herself, Finn napped against a sack of flour, and Marigold leaned her head against Gideon's shoulder. The days that followed passed in steady rhythm. Lessons under the cottonwood for Farah, canning peaches, fixing the barn door hinge. A new foal born with a white blaze down its nose. Nights spent with Gideon's hand resting lightly on Marigold's back, her laughter woven into the hush of dusk. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars blinked awake, Gideon pulled a small ring from his coat pocket. Silver, nothing fancy but shaped with care, he held it out to her without kneeling, without flourish. "I don't have a preacher's words," he said, "but I've got land, 2 hands, and a steady heart. I want to build a life with you, not as a helper or a guest. As my wife." Marigold looked at the ring, then at him. Then at the house behind them, the lantern glowing in the window, the sound of Farah reading aloud to her brother from a primer with a cracked spine. She took the ring and slid it on her finger. "That's all I ever wanted," she said. "Something real, something that lasts." And so it did. They were married beneath the cottonwood, with Farah scattering wildflowers and Finn holding Gideon's hat like it was a crown. The preacher came from town, the neighbors brought pies, and someone played a fiddle until the sun dipped behind the ridge. Marigold wore a dress she'd sewn herself. Gideon wore his best shirt and looked at her like nothing else had ever mattered. That night, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, they lay together beneath the open window, the breeze soft on their skin. "You still waiting for the ground to give way?" Gideon asked, brushing her hair back from her face. "No," she whispered. "I'm standing still for the first time." Their life unfolded in quiet, steady days. Marigold taught the children of the valley to read and reckon numbers. Gideon broke new ground for planting and fixed fences that stayed mended. Farah grew taller with her mother's quiet strength. Finn learned to ride before he could write his name, and he never stopped wearing Gideon's old hat. And through every season, high summer, deep frost, spring thaw, they loved each other with the kind of care that doesn't ask for proof, only presence. They never left the land. They didn't need to. Because everything they needed had already come home.